The gunshot echoed through the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, Montana, causing Zara Zimmerman to drop the basket of eggs she'd just purchased from the general store. She watched in horror as the contents spilled across the dirt, yolks bleeding into the parched earth like macabre yellow wounds, a fitting metaphor for how her life was unraveling on this sweltering August day in 1878. There she is, the thieving harlot. Sheriff Mills bellowed, his voice carrying down the thoroughfare as townsfolk emerged from shops and saloons to witness her public shaming. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I took nothing," she protested, though her voice trembled and failed to carry. The crowd had already decided her guilt. Her crime? Being found in the company of the town's wealthiest merchant, Herbert Wallace, a married man whose wife had discovered them talking privately behind his store. Mrs. Wallace had immediately assumed the worst, and her influential family ensured the entire town believed Zara was not only a home wrecker, but had been stealing from the Wallace household for months. "She's been helping herself to our silverware and my mother's jewelry," Mrs. Wallace shouted from the boardwalk, her face contorted with righteous anger. "Look at her, dressing above her station with money earned on her back." Zara glanced down at her simple blue calico dress, patched twice at the elbow, hardly the garment of a woman living in luxury. The dress had been a gift from her late mother and was her only piece of clothing that wasn't threadbare. "I was merely delivering mending," Zara tried explaining, but the crowd was growing, murmuring their disdain. Someone threw a rotten apple that splattered near her feet. "Search her home." Someone shouted. Sheriff Mills nodded to his deputy. "Already did, found these." He held up a silver candlestick and a pearl necklace that Zara had never seen before. Her stomach dropped, realizing she'd been set up. "That's not mine," she cried, but the damage was done. The town of Redemption Springs had found her guilty without trial. Mrs. Wallace stepped forward, her expensive dress rustling. "We took you in when you had nothing after your parents died. This is how you repay Christian charity, by stealing and seducing my husband." Tears stung Zara's eyes. It wasn't true. None of it was true. Mr. Wallace had merely been kind enough to offer her additional sewing work, knowing she struggled to make ends meet as the town's seamstress after her parents succumbed to influenza last winter. Thief, harlot. The names rang out as more people joined the spectacle. Sheriff Mills grabbed her arm. "You've got two choices, Miss Zimmerman. Face trial and likely prison, or leave Redemption Springs by sundown tomorrow, and don't you come back." Zara yanked her arm free, her cheeks burning with humiliation as laughter and jeers followed her stumbling retreat. With nowhere else to go, she ran to the only place that had ever offered her solace, the small white church at the edge of town. She darted behind the building, collapsing against the weathered clapboards, her body racked with sobs. The church was empty on this Tuesday afternoon, the reverend away visiting sick parishioners in the outlying farms. Here, hidden from prying eyes, Zara finally allowed herself to break down completely. "Everything I've worked for," she whispered to herself, "gone in an instant." Her small home would be forfeit, her meager sewing business destroyed by rumor and innuendo. Where would she go? How would she survive? Lost in her despair, she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across her huddled form. Zara flinched, expecting more accusations, more humiliation. Instead, a deep voice spoke softly. "Mind if I join you?" Zara looked up through tear-swollen eyes to see a tall figure silhouetted against the sun. As he shifted, she recognized him as one of the cowboys who occasionally rode through town with cattle herds. She'd mended his shirt once, remembered his quiet "thank you" and generous payment. Unlike most men, he'd looked her in the eyes when speaking to her, not at her chest or dismissively over her head. "I have nothing worth stealing, if that's what the townsfolk sent you to check," she said bitterly. The cowboy chuckled and lowered himself to sit beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Dawson Xavier. I don't much care what those folks think." He removed his hat, revealing sun-bronzed features and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Saw what happened back there. Seemed to me like a woman being railroaded by people with more power than conscience." "You don't know me," Zara said, wiping her tears with her sleeve. "Don't need to. Seen enough of the Wallaces to know they're the type who'd sooner blame the help than admit their own troubles. He leaned back against the church. Word around the cattle camps is that Wallace's business is failing. Man's been borrowing heavily. Reckon it's easier to claim theft than admit you've gambled away your wife's inheritance. Zara stared at him in surprise. How do you know this? Cowboys hear things. We're invisible to folks like them. They talk freely when they think no one important is listening. He offered her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. So where will you go? The kindness in his gesture nearly undid her again. I don't know. I have until tomorrow's sundown to leave town. Dawson was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon. My outfit's heading to Colorado. Got a herd to deliver. Could use someone who knows their way around a needle and thread, trails hard on clothes. You're offering me a job, you don't even know me. Know enough. He turned to her, his expression serious. Listen, Miss Zimmerman, I can't promise it'll be easy. Trail life is hard, especially for a woman, but the men in my crew are decent sorts who mind their manners. You'd have your own wagon, your privacy. And when we reach Denver, you could start fresh where nobody knows you or these lies about you. It was crazy. Completely insane to consider traveling with a group of cowboys, a woman alone. And yet, what choice did she have? Why would you help me? She asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Maybe because 6 years ago I was run out of a town based on another man's lies, he said quietly. Nobody offered me a hand then, swore if I ever saw someone in the same spot, I'd do different. Before she could respond, the church door opened around the corner and they heard voices. Dawson stood and offered his hand. Come with me now. We can collect your things from your home after dark, when fewer eyes are watching. But Miss Zimmerman, he said, his voice firm but gentle, you can sit here and let them break you, or you can walk proud beside me out of this town of narrow minds. Your choice. Something in his words ignited a spark in Zara. Walk proud. When was the last time she'd done that? Maybe never. She'd always been the orphaned seamstress, scraping by on charity and pity. She placed her hand in his and stood. My name is Zara, she said, squaring her shoulders. Dawson smiled, placing his hat back on his head. Well then, Zara, let's give these fine citizens of Redemption Springs something real to talk about. And with that, he led her out from behind the church, into the afternoon sun, his hand protectively at the small of her back as they walked down the main street. Zara forced herself to keep her head high, even as whispers followed them. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she wasn't walking alone. True to his word, Dawson returned with her after nightfall to her small rented room behind the laundry. He stood guard outside while she gathered her few precious possessions, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, her sewing tools, and the small box of fabric scraps she'd collected. Everything she owned fit into one carpet bag and a sewing basket. That's all, Dawson asked when she emerged. That's all, she confirmed. He nodded, taking her carpet bag. Sometimes starting with less means you appreciate more what comes after. They made their way to the camp outside town where the cattle drive was preparing to move out at first light. Dawson introduced her to the trail boss, a grizzled man named Russell, who eyed her skeptically but nodded his approval when Dawson vouched for her skills. We got a supply wagon, needs someone to drive it, Russell said. Can you handle a team? My father taught me, Zara replied, relieved she could offer some useful skill beyond sewing. Good, you'll bunk in the wagon. Any man gives you trouble, you tell me or Xavier here. Russell fixed her with a hard stare. I run a clean outfit, no disrespect to women on my drive. Thank you, sir, she said, surprised by his straightforward acceptance. As Dawson showed her to the wagon that would be her home for the next weeks, she asked quietly, Why does he trust your judgment about me? Dawson smiled in the lantern light. Saved his life once during an Apache raid. Man reckons he owes me. Besides, he knows I wouldn't bring trouble to the outfit. And am I trouble, Mr. Xavier? She asked, suddenly aware of how dependent she was on this man's goodwill. Dawson, he corrected. And no, I don't believe you are. Trouble found you, but that's different from carrying it inside you. He handed her the lantern. Get some rest. Dawn comes early on the trail. That night, lying in the wagon beneath a wool blanket that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, Zara stared up at the canvas cover and wondered what madness had led her to trust this cowboy. Yet for the first time in months, She felt a flicker of hope. Whatever waited down the trail, it had to be better than the shame she'd left behind. The cattle drive began at dawn, the herd moving slowly along the trail as cowboys rode alongside, keeping the animals together. Zara drove her wagon, following the chuck wagon that carried their food supplies. Her hands remembered the feel of the reins, and she found comfort in the rhythmic plodding of the draft horses. For the first few days, the other cowboys regarded her with curiosity and some suspicion. But as the drive settled into its routine and she began mending torn shirts and split pants in the evenings by the campfire, they gradually accepted her presence. She kept to herself, speaking little except to Dawson, who made a point of checking on her each evening. On the fourth night, as she sat by the fire darning a sock for Cookie, the chuck wagon cook, Dawson brought her a tin cup of coffee and sat beside her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "It's strange, but I feel freer here than I did in town." "Trail has a way of stripping things down to what matters," he said, watching the flames. "No room for pretense when you're facing the same hardships together." "The men have been respectful," she observed. "They would be," Dawson replied with a slight smile. "Russell made it clear anyone who wasn't would answer to him, and me." Zara looked at him curiously. "You've gone to great lengths to help a stranger." Dawson was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe you reminded me of someone." "Who?" "My sister," he said softly. She found herself in a similar situation, man with power making accusations, town believing him over her. His jaw tightened. Difference is, she couldn't leave, had children to consider, a husband who believed the worst. What happened to her? She took her own life. The words hung heavy in the night air. "Found her in the barn. I was 15. That's when I left home, headed west." "I'm sorry," Zara whispered, understanding now the shadows that sometimes crossed his face. "Been a long time," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "Point is, sometimes people need someone to believe in them when nobody else will." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of camp. One of the younger cowboys came running, breathless with excitement. Riders coming, 6, maybe 7. Russell was on his feet immediately, hand on his pistol. "Apache?" "Don't think so," the young man said. "Look like white men." The trail boss turned to the gathered cowboys. "Everyone armed, ladies and gentlemen, we may have company of the unwelcome sort." Zara felt fear rise in her throat as Dawson stood. "Stay by the wagon," he told her. "If there's trouble, get under it and stay put." She nodded, clutching her sewing to her chest as the cowboys spread out, rifles and pistols at the ready. The approaching riders came into view, silhouetted against the darkening sky. "That's Sheriff Mills," Zara gasped, recognizing the lead rider. Dawson's expression hardened. "So it is." The riders pulled up at the edge of camp, Mills in the lead with Herbert Wallace and 4 other men behind him. "Evening, gentlemen," Russell called out. "Something we can help you with?" Mills pointed directly at Zara. "We've come for her. She's wanted for theft in Redemption Springs." "That a fact," Russell said, his tone deceptively casual. "She stole valuables from Mr. Wallace here," Mills continued. "We're taking her back to stand trial." Dawson stepped forward. "Funny timing, Sheriff. You wait until she's miles from town with witnesses who might speak for her." Wallace dismounted, his face flushed with either anger or the exertion of riding. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy. The woman is a thief and worse. And I suppose you've got witnesses, evidence that wasn't planted." Dawson's voice was dangerous now. Mills reddened. "Watch your accusations, Xavier. I remember you from your last time through. Always were too quick to side against decent folk." Russell moved to stand beside Dawson. "The lady works for me now. She's under my protection on this drive." "You're harboring a criminal," Mills insisted. "She hasn't been tried or convicted," Russell pointed out. "And last I checked, your jurisdiction ended about 3 days' ride back." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Zara found herself moving to stand near Dawson, her fear giving way to anger. These men had chased her miles from town to continue their persecution. "I took nothing," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the night air. "Mr. Wallace offered me extra sewing work because I needed money after my parents died. That's all. His wife found us talking and assumed the worst. Then suddenly stolen items appear in my home, items I never saw before." Wallace stepped toward her, pointing an accusing finger. You ungrateful, that's far enough, Dawson interrupted, moving slightly in front of Zara. You've got no authority here, Wallace, neither does your pet sheriff. One of Wallace's men reached for his gun, but Russell was faster, his rifle coming up to aim at the man's chest. I wouldn't. Mills looked around at the circle of cowboys, all armed and watching carefully. He clearly hadn't expected such resistance. This isn't over, he warned. She'll have to return eventually. No, Zara said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. I don't. There's nothing for me in Redemption Springs but lies and shame for something I didn't do. Wallace sneered. Who'll believe the word of a seamstress over mine? I would, Dawson said firmly. As would I, added Russell. One by one, the other cowboys murmured agreement, forming a protective circle around Zara. Outnumbered and outgunned, Mills finally conceded defeat. Come on, he told Wallace. We've wasted enough time on this. As the riders departed, Zara felt her knees weaken. Dawson caught her elbow, steadying her. You stood your ground, he said quietly. Proud of you for that. That night marked a turning point. Word of how she'd stood up to the sheriff spread through the camp, and the last barriers of reserve among the cowboys melted away. She was no longer just the woman they tolerated. She was one of them, someone who'd faced down trouble with courage. As the cattle drive continued south toward Colorado, Zara found herself drawn more and more to Dawson. He never presumed, never pushed, but was always there with a kind word or helping hand. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, and he'd tell her stories of places he'd seen: the mountains of Montana, the deserts of Arizona, the forests of Oregon. Have you ever thought of settling down? She asked him one night. 3 weeks into their journey, Dawson considered the question. Used to think I wasn't made for it, too restless, too used to moving on. He looked at her, the firelight casting his features in gold. Been thinking differently lately. Her heart quickened at his words and the way his eyes held hers. What changed? Met someone worth considering a different path for, he said simply. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted from the cattle herd. Shouts and the sound of running hooves filled the night air. Stampede. Someone yelled. Dawson was on his feet instantly. Stay here, he ordered, then ran for his horse. The next hours were chaos. A mountain lion had spooked the cattle, sending them running in the darkness. The cowboys rode desperately to turn the herd, to prevent the animals from scattering or running off cliffs in their blind panic. Zara watched helplessly from camp as men rode out into the night, Dawson among them. The sound of thundering hooves gradually receded, but the shouting continued, distant now. It was nearly dawn when the cowboys began returning to camp, exhausted and mud splattered. They'd managed to control the stampede, but not without cost. 2 horses had gone down and several men had injuries from falls. Where's Dawson? Zara asked Russell when he returned. The trail boss's expression was grim. Still out there. His horse stumbled in a gopher hole, saw him go down hard. Terror gripped her heart. Is he? Don't know, Russell admitted. 3 men are still looking. Unable to simply wait, Zara climbed onto the wagon seat. I'm going to help search. Russell looked like he might object, then nodded. Take a lantern, follow the creek bed south, that's where we last saw him. She drove the wagon as fast as she dared in the pre-dawn light, following the path of destruction left by the stampede. About 2 miles from camp, she saw 3 riders moving slowly through the brush, calling Dawson's name. Any sign? She called to them. One shook his head. Been looking since it happened. Nothing. Zara felt sick with worry. She tied the wagon horses to a tree and took the lantern, moving carefully through the trampled grass and mud. Dawson, she called. Dawson, can you hear me? Only silence answered. She moved farther from the creek, scanning the ground carefully. Something intuition perhaps drew her toward a stand of cottonwoods. Dawson, she called again. This time she heard a faint groan. Heart pounding, she hurried toward the sound, holding the lantern high. She found him half hidden in tall grass, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, his face pale with pain and blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. Zara, he whispered, squinting in the lantern light. I'm here, she said, kneeling beside him. Don't move, your leg looks broken. Found that out when I tried to walk, he managed, his voice strained. Horse rolled over me, think some ribs might be broken too. she called to the other searchers who quickly joined her. Together, they fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and shirts and carefully moved Dawson to her wagon. Every jolt of the wagon on the way back to camp brought a grimace of pain to his face, though he tried to hide it. The camp's mood was somber when they returned. Cookie, who had some experience with field medicine, examined Dawson's injuries. Legs broken for sure, he confirmed. Need to set it proper. Ribs are likely cracked, not broken through. Head wound ain't too deep, but he'll have one hell of a headache. We're 3 days from the nearest town with a doctor, Russell said worriedly. I can set the leg, Cookie said. Done it before, but he can't ride. Need to keep him still while it heals. Russell considered their options. We can't stop the drive. Cattle need to keep moving to water and grass. I'll stay with him, Zara volunteered immediately. We can follow in the wagon once he's well enough to travel, the trail boss frowned. Leaving you two alone out here is risky. Indians, outlaws, wild animals. We've got weapons, she pointed out, and we'll follow your trail. What choice do we have? He can't be bounced around in a wagon for 3 days, and he can't ride. In the end, Russell reluctantly agreed. They found a suitable campsite near a small stream with good visibility and plenty of wood for fires. The chuck wagon left them with enough supplies for 2 weeks. We'll send riders back to check on you every few days, Russell promised. Should reach Denver in about 3 weeks. If you haven't caught up by then, I'll send help back. As the cattle drive moved on the next morning, Zara found herself alone with Dawson for the first time. He lay in her wagon on a bed of blankets, his legs splinted and bound, his ribs wrapped tight. The pain-killing herbs Cookie had given him kept him drifting in and out of sleep most of the day. That evening, as she tended the fire and prepared a simple stew, he watched her through half-lidded eyes. You should have gone with them, he said softly, and leave you here alone, not a chance. She stirred the pot, avoiding his gaze. You've known me barely a month. Long enough to know you wouldn't abandon me if our positions were reversed. She brought him a cup of water, helping him lift his head to drink. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't try walking on that leg too soon. A weak smile crossed his face. Stubborn woman. Takes one to know one, Cowboy. The days that followed established a simple routine. Zara tended to Dawson's injuries, changing bandages and preparing meals. She helped him move from the wagon to sit by the fire when he felt strong enough. They talked for hours, learning each other's stories, filling in the gaps of their lives. She told him about growing up as the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had taught her to sew and cook. About their deaths from influenza the previous winter, leaving her alone in a town where she'd never quite belonged. He shared more about his sister, about leaving home at 15 and working his way west, about the years spent learning to be a cowboy, about lonely nights under vast skies wondering if he'd ever find a place that felt like home. On the 7th day, as she changed the bandage on his head, his hand caught hers. Thank you, he said simply, not just for this, for everything. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he drew her hand to his lips and placed a gentle kiss on her palm. Zara's breath caught. No man had ever treated her with such tenderness, such respect. I'm falling in love with you, Zara Zimmerman, he said quietly. Should have probably waited to say that, but nearly dying makes a man reconsider the value of time. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that answered his confession more eloquently than words could have. When they parted, she whispered, I think I started falling the moment you sat beside me behind that church and told me to walk proud. Their courtship unfolded in this unlikely place, a wilderness camp with just the two of them, the stars overhead, and the distant howls of coyotes as their only witnesses. They spoke of futures, of possibilities, of dreams long set aside that now seemed within reach. By the time riders from the cattle drive returned to check on them 10 days later, Dawson was able to sit a horse for short periods, though the pain still etched lines in his face when he thought Zara wasn't looking. Boss says the drive's making good time, the young cowboy named Jimson reported. Should reach Denver in about 10 days. You two planning to catch up? Dawson and Zara exchanged a look. We'll follow, Dawson said, but at our own pace. Tell Russell we're obliged for his concern. After Jimson left, Zara asked, "Are you sure you're ready to travel?" "Not entirely," Dawson admitted, "but staying in one place too long isn't wise. We've been lucky so far." They packed up camp the next morning and began following the well-marked trail of the cattle drive. They traveled slowly, stopping frequently to allow Dawson to rest. What should have been a 3-day journey stretched to 6, but Zara found she didn't mind. Each night by the campfire, their bond deepened. On the 4th night, Dawson produced a small box from his saddlebag. "Was going to wait until Denver," he said, "but I'm not a patient man." He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring with a small pearl. "Belonged to my mother. Would you wear it, Zara? Would you marry me when we reach Denver?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, words failing her. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they sealed their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows they would share. They reached Denver 2 days after the cattle drive had arrived. Russell was surprised but pleased to see them, especially noting the ring on Zara's finger and the way Dawson couldn't seem to stop smiling despite the obvious pain his injuries still caused him. "About time," the trail boss said gruffly. "Been wondering when you'd figure out what was plain to the rest of us weeks ago." Denver in 1878 was a bustling city, a far cry from Redemption Springs. After Dawson consulted a proper doctor who confirmed his leg was healing well, they found a preacher willing to marry them with Russell and 2 other cowboys as witnesses. Zara wore a new dress of pale blue, purchased with money she'd earned on the cattle drive. Dawson had shaved and bought a new shirt, though he still walked with a noticeable limp. Neither of them cared about such details. What mattered was the vow they made to walk beside each other, proud and true, for all their remaining days. After the ceremony, Russell presented them with an unexpected gift: their pay from the cattle drive plus a bonus. "Might help you get started," he said awkwardly, uncomfortable with sentiment. "Heard the mercantile over on Cherry Creek is looking for a manager, owners getting on in years. Might suit a man who knows cattle and trading, and I reckon a town growing as fast as Denver could use a good seamstress." Dawson thanked him with a hearty handshake. "You've been more than fair, boss." "Wasn't just fair," Russell replied. "Was right. You 2 earned your way." He cleared his throat. "Got another drive coming up in the spring if you find city life doesn't suit you." But city life did suit them. Dawson got the mercantile job and within 2 years had bought the store when the owner retired. Zara's seamstress business thrived, expanding to include ready-made clothing as Denver's population boomed. They bought a small house with a garden where Zara grew vegetables and flowers. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived a year after their wedding. A son, Michael, followed 2 years later. Their home rang with laughter and occasional arguments, like any family's, but always with the underlying current of deep love and respect. Sometimes on summer evenings, they would sit on their porch watching their children play, and Dawson would take Zara's hand, his thumb brushing over the silver ring he'd given her. "Ever regret it?" he'd ask, a teasing glint in his eyes. "Trusting a broken-down cowboy who found you crying behind a church?" And Zara would smile, thinking of the journey that had brought them here: the public shaming, the fear, the cattle drive, the slow healing beside a campfire in the wilderness. All of it leading to this life they'd built together. "Best decision I ever made," she'd reply, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Walking proud beside you." In time, the memories of Redemption Springs faded like an old photograph left too long in the sun. They heard through the occasional passing cowboy that Herbert Wallace had indeed lost his business to gambling debts, that his wife had left him, that the truth of his accusations against Zara had eventually come to light. But such news meant little to them now. Their story, the real story, had moved beyond that small town and its small minds. It was written instead in the life they'd created together, in the love that had begun with a simple act of kindness behind a church, when a cowboy sat beside a shamed woman and offered her the chance to walk proud. And walk proud they did, side by side, for all the days that followed.